Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Know Your Builder, or KYB. I'm Sinkas from L2B together with Christoph, and today we're joined by Carl Cervone and Raymond Cheng from Open Source Observer to talk about their project and get to know them a bit better. Carl, Raymond, do you want to kick us off with introducing yourselves and telling us who you are?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Ray, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, happy to go first. So my name is Raymond Cheng. I come from more of the engineering technical background. I would say my life in crypto, kind of came in three waves, and I'm on my third wave now, where I started life as an academic, publishing papers. I was a PhD student for some time. I did postdoc in the more on the protocol level side of things, so distributed systems, applied cryptography. Publishing academic papers. And then my second life kind of started when we spun out some of that research into some work into building an L1. It's Oasis Labs was a privacy preserving smart contract platform that we launched back in 2018. And then I took a little bit of time from crypto and came back and now wanted to focus on the public good side of things. One of the things that I noticed during my time there was that some of the most interesting problems here are trying to understand how to grow ecosystems, how to create healthy communities and healthy collectives. And so that's kind of how I got back into crypto, was chatting with Carl, chatting with people at Protocol Labs, starting on understanding different ways to fund impact, which is how I started on this journey of building out Open Source Observer with the team.
Great.
Yeah,
And
great. So as Ray said, we met at Protocol Labs about 2 years ago. And before that, I wasn't working in crypto. I was doing some nights and weekend stuff, but I was running a Web2 startup in the commodity supply chain space. We would help big coffee companies figure out where their coffee came from, analyze the entire supply chain, help identify risks, and then design programs to act on those risks. So it's kind of similar in the sense that we were trying to figure out, trace like the entire dependency graph of coffee in this case. And now we're doing that to software. And it was obviously a very different model where everything we were doing was kind of, closed source. It was built on private data sets. And we were able to create this really, really valuable source of insights that companies would pay for. So it was kind of with that background. And also, I should add that before that, I spent a good amount of my time kind of working overseas in places that had pretty difficult economic conditions. I lived for 5 years in Ethiopia, which has had a closed economy, lots of inflation. I spent a lot of time living abroad in places that did not have the same kind of economic infrastructure that you get like in the United States. And so I remember I think it was in Rwanda when I read about the Bitcoin white paper and said, oh my goodness, like this just makes so much sense. And I would love to have this here. And then I remember the internet went out and I kind of forgot about it. And then a few years later, it was a big thing. But in any case, I had always wanted to spend more time and to get into crypto full time. It wasn't until joining Protocol Labs in 2022 when I was able to do that. And then, as Ray said, we were kind of researching the idea of creating impact markets for Protocol Labs and their network of public goods, which includes IPFS, Filecoin, libp2p, a number of other projects. And in doing so, we were kind of looking for real examples where there was significant funding going towards kind of impact markets. And there wasn't a lot of that happening at that time in Protocol Labs. But just over the corner in Optimism and the Ethereum ecosystem, we could see a lot of that happening and some experiments running. And so that was really what got us excited. And we kind of began as a side project, but just kept spending more and more time thinking about this problem. And one thing led to another, and here we are.
all right, that's
So
great.
before
Please go ahead.
we dig deeper, can you just like let's jump straight ahead and can you tell us like what Open Source Observer is? Like how can we use it? What can we learn from it? Like can you show it to us?
So, Open Source Observer, we are creating a free analytics suite that helps funders and then anybody else who kind of cares about the health of open source ecosystems to measure what's happening, track contribution activity, build really rich network graphs, and ultimately try and come up with metrics or other indicators that help them understand how the ecosystem is doing, how products are doing, and measure the effectiveness of different grant programs and funding. Right now, Our website has not been the focus of our work. We've been much more intent on creating this really big data lake, which joins together various data sets. And I can give you kind of a quick preview of what that looks like. So if we go to the docs over here, one of the first entry points for many people is to come and actually start exploring some of the data sets that we have. So if you want to get a sense of what we've curated, we have a very large set of kind of labeled projects, collections, and then artifacts that are owned by projects, which we call, which kind of begins with something called open source software directory, where we basically maintain this kind of collection of labeled projects and the things that they own. And then that kind of powers this pretty powerful pipeline, which then goes and looks at data from GitHub, from Open Source Insights, which is tracking dependencies, from Ethereum, from Optimism and all of the superchain data sets, Arbitrum. We can continue to add additional layer twos as well, because they all roughly have the same schema. We also have Filecoin data. We bring in the social graph from Farcaster, Lens. We've also brought on like Gitcoin Passport data. OpenRank is a kind of open protocol for creating graphs. So we've used that as well for a couple of different use cases. We have Ethereum attestation service. We also have Web2 funding data from Open Collective. And so this is just kind of the starting point. There's other data sets that we haven't actually added here. But what we're trying to do is create these kind of common models that can speak to each other and connect data from disparate sources, and then use that to track different types of activity over time and ultimately help funders make better funding decisions. I think, as all of us know, there's a lot of teams that are working with on-chain data. We aren't trying to kind of replicate all of that infrastructure. What we're actually trying to do is identify existing public data sets and then enrich them with data from other sources. So again, GitHub data is a pretty clear link, because you can identify a team that is working on something, and then you can tie that to the deployer or any of the contracts that they've deployed on different chains, and you can connect those two. Where a lot of our focus is these days is kind of going beyond those kind of first two levels in the graph and trying to identify end user activity, and then the other end, the whole kind of software supply chain upstream to all the dependencies that these products are using. So yeah, a lot of the work that we're doing is kind of in this really big data warehouse, building models, trying to generate metrics, trying to connect different data sets, and then finding useful ways of surfacing that to different communities.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, you've kind of created like almost like a data marketplace without the market kind of thing. Like it's open source and publicly available. So if someone wants, to use any of that data, they don't have to go out and collect them themselves, but rather they can go to Open Source Observer and get it. Is that?
I would say instead of a market, I'd probably have more of a cooperative model where all of these different data sets are actually produced by different partners. We don't actually, like, some of the indexing we do ourselves, but some of the indexing always starts with somebody else. And so, in this community, we have a bunch of people that are contributing into this data lake. And then we also have, a couple dozen modelers that also build into the data pipeline different ways to analyze this data, join it in different ways, think about metrics, think about impact, think about ROI in different ways for different communities. So it's definitely not, one of the things that we were talking about earlier is like, is this in itself, a product that we plan on selling? No, this is when we first started, that was the first question that we were asked when we were nucleated out of PL is, do you plan on hiding this behind a traditional proprietary, commercial service? You can sell insights. There's well-known business models for that. That's just not in our DNA. That's just not what we wanted to do. I think it's much more valuable when you can channel the power of the community, channel the power of the network to actually do something together. So again, I think a much better model here is a cooperative model where we're building out this insights engine together.
Okay, so like a public goods data aggregator in a way. Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we like our first public blog post was really just about kind of announcing that we wanted to be not just kind of open source or open data, but also have our infrastructure be completely open as well. And that was a constraint that has led us to do a lot of things that probably would take much longer than if we were to just, put everything in our own pipeline and close it off. So you can literally go in and you can see all of our jobs that we're running. You can see the entire lineage of any model that we have. Again, you could fork it, or you could actually just take one of these models, view it, and contribute in your own way. And the challenge here, of course, is that it's becoming an increasingly complicated, set of models and how they relate to each other. But on the other hand, we really want to make it so that anybody can identify an opportunity to improve, and they can either connect a new data set, or they can fork a model or propose an improvement. And at the very least, when it comes to tracking, say, metrics that are used for funding, we want everybody to be able to audit our models all the way back to source. Where did this data come from? What were the choices that were made in creating different metrics and in deciding what to include and what to filter out and so on. So that entire lineage graph is completely visible to anybody involved or who might have an interest in it.
So can you give us some examples of the questions that could be answered using your data? And like we know that you are very ingrained with optimism and how the collective makes decisions on the different grant designs, program designs. What kind of questions do you answer? Like what kind of things can I solve by using open source observer?
Yeah, it's a good question. One thing that I will say is that we don't really want to be viewed as the only people that can answer questions. I think right now, because this is a complex data set, it's very large, people often come to us first to try and answer, how long has this project been around? Or I want to look at Farcaster and identify how many users that are on Farcaster are also interacting with this protocol, and then see upstream of that, what are its dependencies? We're in a position to be able to answer those questions, but ultimately we want to create enough examples and tutorials where anybody could come in and find the answers to their own questions, or even build their own kind of products on top of that. But I would say right now, there's a set of on-chain metrics that are pretty straightforward that we're able to calculate and kind of link back to any project and all of the contracts that it owns, or that it is able to kind of trace back to its factories. More interesting right now, I would say, is trying to look at the entire software supply chain and identify, here could be something we care about on-chain, like sequencer fee contribution or a number of active users. And we can actually go a few layers up the stack and identify which developer libraries were used by the teams that were building those protocols, and identify metrics that might be associated with the teams that are developing those kind of core dependencies that are now powering these on-chain applications. I think the part that is kind of underexplored at this point is seeing, if you were to simulate or do scenarios on different types of funding outcomes, which ones would perform better over time. We kind of began at the time when retrofunding 2 was happening, and we'd actually like to see, if you were to, let's say that you want to optimize for the number of teams that had retained their developers over the last 2 years or so, what kind of funding strategies might have been predictive of that? Or you could model other scenarios where different sets of products were included, what might have happened in those cases. That type of kind of hypothesis testing and exploratory analysis, we've unfortunately been able to do very little time, dedicate very little time to those types of questions. Right now, it's been much more, I have a collection of 100 projects. There's 10 metrics that I care about. Help me identify, a good way of comparing these projects against those set of metrics over a period of time.
Yeah, it almost feels like, in this cooperative model, we're building a factory together. I think like one of the ways that people traditionally think about data analytics products is that they think about it in terms of, okay, what are like the very specific insights I can get at the output end of this factory? And by completely opening it up, I think one of the things that we're really excited about is this open innovation model, because it's incredible how much we can measure in this ecosystem. It's one of those few industries where you can measure the entire value chain. We have data sets on how projects are funded, and you can take a look at not just how they're funded on Gitcoin, but also airdrops and other ways, retrofunding, and we're starting to onboard more and more grant data. You can see like the diverse sets of support going into projects. You can also see everything that they're doing on GitHub. I mean, that's pretty incredible. Obviously that's something that we take advantage of, but it's not very common in many industries where you can see the entire provenance of what everybody is doing in terms of productivity. And then as Carl was saying, you can map that all the way out to what people are shipping, both in the software supply chain, but also on chain. Like think of any other industry where you can see globally how every single product, how every single application, what their retention is, what their user numbers are, where their users are coming and going, how much value they're spending on chain. That kind of data is unheard of in any other industry. So once we put all those things together in a data lake and empower the community, I mean, in theory, you could answer any question. And again, I think part of our focus here is to kind of be empowering, be kind of like a set of tool builders to enable the community to do a bunch of different things. Of course, with the optimism community, there are a set of questions that they're really focused on. And so we try as best as possible to empower not just ourselves and the people within our team, but also OP Labs and other data scientists within the collective to also answer these types of questions. But I think there's something like really powerful once you put all these data sets out there as a public data set. You can start to take a look at the correlations between things that we've never really looked at correlations between before. And one of the things that we're just recently starting to think about is like, well, what if you actually if you actually have clean data of an entire economy, not just on investment, but also production, but also outputs. What are the types of algorithms that we can experiment with that you wouldn't be able to experiment with in any other industry? We started looking at some machine learning models to figure out what are the types of weights that you can use to and what types of algorithms are best predictive of success or growth or retention or developers, all sorts of things. I think we're just in the very early days of figuring out what we can even do with this amount of power.
I have a question about the data, or rather what you do with it, kind of like a follow-up or build up on Christoph's question is, do you just like gather the data and kind of like present it, or do you also form opinions, let's say, based on that? Like, do you try to use the data on your own to come up, to your own conclusions and offer advice or whatever? Or is it just, here's the data we've collected, you guys figure it out? Like, do you try to be opinionated or not?
I think.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
What would you say, Ray?
And it's not to clarify, it's not like a curveball question. I'm just generally asking,
Yeah, no, totally. I think like the way that I think about it is that the platform has to be credibly neutral, right? So where the data is coming from, any particular model that gets deployed, we have to be able to understand the provenance of that model. And to the extent that the goal is to empower the community to make insights and have interesting discourse that's data informed, the platform and the data itself absolutely has to be neutral. Now, any particular individual in this collective, in this community is going to be opinionated. That's like impossible to not have. Everybody has different opinions. I would say Carl and I, even with amongst ourselves, we have different opinions of like what does this data say? How much rigor are we actually applying and when analyzing this data and coming to these types of conclusions? I feel like today the level of rigor that we're using for data science in general is definitely on the less mature side. And I think one of the things that I want to see is more maturity in scientific rigor and analysis and understanding whether or not this is just correlation or causation. I think we're very much in the early days of analytics, and that includes almost any other analytics platform of how people are thinking about metrics and thinking about how to interpret this data. It's definitely not very scientific yet. I'm hoping that will change in the future, but because it's not scientific yet, it naturally leads to a world where everybody has different opinions about how to interpret this data. And certainly I have my own biases and opinions, and I'm sure Carl does too, and they don't always line up, and I think that's totally okay. I think one of the things that when optimism engages in us, they are looking for our individual opinions as well, in addition to building out this credibly neutral platform. But I do want to like kind of separate those two things, right? In the sense that like I don't think the platform itself is in any way opinionated.
Yeah, I think
the only thing I'd add is that we want grant programs to succeed. We want this kind of funding, this kind of decentralized funding on crypto rails to work. Right now, if we're honest with ourselves, it is not working. We don't really know if anything is having an impact. If you look at airdrops and which ones have actually been able to retain committed users, it's probably pretty scary if you were to look at that. If we look at open source grants, again, there's a huge amount of grant farming, and then teams that are going in, getting a grant over here, doing the minimum, and then going to the next ecosystem and not really sticking around. So we both know that like we want this to work, and the baseline of how things are going is pretty low right now. Our goal really is to find the right sweet spot between having useful data that can help funders make better decisions, and at the same time being able to scale this so that you can start getting more projects, and it takes less time to review each of those projects. And ideally, you can get more targeted at the types of funding that you're putting out there. But I feel like we're very, very early days in that journey right now, and we're really just trying to keep things as open as possible without constraining the sets of questions that people could ask of the data.
Yeah.
So I can totally relate to that because, like me being the badge holder in Optimism,
Right.
I spend a fair amount of time trying to, assess the impact that different projects had on Optimism or in general.
Right.
And I would like to ask a question right now, like how how do you relate to optimism? Like what is like how do you see optimism? How do you see this approach to funding, especially retro funding and optimism? You were working a lot with optimism, different teams to help this decision making. How do you see it? How do you see this grant funding design? And what did you learn so far in your opinion?
Let me first say, I think there's something important about optimism, which is the reason that I think, that attracted us in the first place, and is the reason that we are focused mostly on optimism. Um, they are playing a repeated game. They are basically saying, we want to create a signal that there is going to be funding for builders that contribute in a certain way, and it's going to be ideally scaling up over time. Um, I think it's very difficult right now to point to other grant programs that have that kind of continuity and that credible commitment that they are going to keep funding certain types of contributions. Now, that said, and Chris, you know this as well as anyone, every round there has been a lot of changes, a lot of things that if you had been depending on the way things worked in retrofunding 2 or retrofunding 3, then you were in for a pretty big surprise when retrofunding 4 came around. And even now, 2025, things are going to be different. So there is a lot of changing of the rules as we're playing the game, which has made this, I think, certainly more difficult for builders, and also difficult for anyone who wants to measure over a period of time the success of the program, or the issues with the program. But I think that is what has made optimism retrofunding interesting for us, is that there is this credible commitment, 850 million OP, from the Genesis, that is going towards funding public goods in the optimism ecosystem. So that means that there's kind of a desire to show that this program is working, that it's incentivizing net new behaviors, and there's going to be some frequent set of experiments that are happening. And our goal has always been, okay, how can we learn from each one of these to make the next one better? Now, hopefully, over time, the rules are going to get a bit more predictable and a bit more constant. And so you can actually start changing, a smaller set of variables and identifying which of these things are actually having, a better result than the rounds that came before it. So again, I think it's important to say this is what's unique, I think, about optimism, and why this is a really important experiment that, we wish more ecosystems would have the audacity of putting out a very large amount and saying, we're going to keep funding these things over time and hope to get it better and better. I think yeah, well, actually, Ray, what would you add to that before I continue?
I mean, I think that is important. The fact that there is a credible commitment to wanting to fund the ecosystem regularly, I think that's important. But I think one of the things that I'm most drawn to is twofold. One is that there is a willingness to experiment and fail in the open and fail publicly in a way that is a little bit vulnerable, but actually very cool, because a lot of time that's not very common. I would say, like, most people generally try to present that they have like the finished solution when they typically don't. So I think that kind of curiosity, willingness to learn, willingness to experiment, and willingness to change when things aren't working is really great, and that we've seen in the collective. But I would say in general also the way that we were kind of drawn to this community, not to one of the things that we worked on while we were at Protocol Labs that we're in the general same group of, it was a group called Network Goods. And one of the things that we're working on there was just generally funding impact, measuring impact. And there was an early program there called Impact Evaluators, which was very similar, right? I think like it had a very data-driven approach to wanting to quantify impact and then find ways to create this feedback loop where if you fund more impact, you get more impact. And I think I think we were very naturally drawn to Ethers Phoenix, the vision there, retro funding, and this idea of wanting to try to quantify impact and understand it better. I think there are a lot of communities right now that are still flying a little bit blind. And I think one of the things that we want to push, the Overton window on is to try to get more communities to also be data driven, to drive more communities to think more rigorously about what are their goals, what are the things that they care about, and how can they even measure that in the first place? And fully understanding that data is just a weak signal to whether or not you're actually achieving the human goals that you care about. But I think one of the things that we've really resonated with in the optimism community is an understanding that data can be a really powerful accelerant. It helps you demystify things that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. These ecosystems are so big. We're funding hundreds, thousands of projects right now. It's not actually technically feasible for individuals to actually go in and do diligence everything without data. And so I think that's something that we've really resonated with. As far as like our involvement with the collective, we're just very naturally drawn to this way of working and this philosophy and this culture of being, data driven. And so as a company, the company behind what Carl and I are doing is a company called the KYB Labs. We are very proud members of the collective, and we, as participants in the Citizens House and other forms of governance, we just want to push it forward and see how much better we can make it.
Cool. And speaking of the collective and the work you've done through RPGF, like the measuring there, Christoph is well too familiar with. I wanted to ask, and I'm not sure if it's like a touchy subject or anything, because I know like you're open source. Have you like received funding from Optimism or from other ecosystems, and has this support been like material for what you're building?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, 100%. I feel like a lot of times in some ways you can think of us as like a small business in this new economy that we're building, at least the way that we've been built so far. That like none of this is secret. Like we try to operate as publicly as possible. We did have like, when we spun out from Protocol Labs, we did get a small, initial capital to kind of get started there. But I would say the vast majority of our revenue and our ability to support ourselves thus far has been through grants, through various ecosystems. In the optimism world, we started small, right? Like we started with a really small 5-figure builder grant, and we try to demonstrate as much value as we could through that. And then over time, like, with retro funding, in the most recent retro funding round that we got, just a little bit over 6 figures worth of OP. And I think we're like incredibly proud to like be one of the success cases of retro funding, where we try to demonstrate as much impact as we can, and we scale that. And as we scale that, the community, rewards us for it. So 100%, like we wouldn't be able to do what we currently do without this kind of support. We've been effectively fully bootstrapped this entire time that we've started. Yeah, we're excited to continue working with communities that think that what we do has value.
Yeah, I'll also add that we've been receiving funding from Gitcoin, from Octant. We've gotten some grants from a few other ecosystems like Arbitrum and Protocol Labs. So taken together, that's allowed us to bootstrap.
Yeah, all the love to the platforms trying to fund public goods. Like L2B has been in the receiving end of some of that as well. So yeah, kudos to all those teams. Right, and in terms of the builder grant that you mentioned, I was curious, what was your experience with kind of like getting that in terms of interfacing with the DAO, right? Because I suppose you had to go through the grants council to get that. Like, what was the experience from the builder requesting a grant perspective?
Yeah, so I think I was the one who dealt with that mostly. It was pretty straightforward. I've done, as you can imagine, a lot of grant applications over the past year or so. Working with the Grants Council was very efficient. The questions they got showed that they had, got an understanding of what we were doing and so on, asked good questions. The only part that's always a little bit tricky is like the KYB steps. But barring that, everything was pretty straightforward. I think we shipped everything that we said we were going to do. We did it ahead of schedule, and we were kind of really proud to show off that we had taken this and done exactly what we said. And then it kind of ended around the time of retrofunding 3, so we were able to unveil what we built at that time. So it was a great way of getting onboarded.
All right, all right. Yeah, I'm always curious to learn about the perspective of, people on the receiving end. Either that's like from the grounds council, like grounds, or like direct to DAO things in other ecosystems. It's, I think it's very telling in terms of how efficient the pipeline is, or how efficient work the DAO or the council does. Of the experiences that people have, like whether it's straightforward, complicated, difficult to find, whatever.
Yeah, one thing I'd say that's probably unique about us is that we've always been very independent. And so we will put milestones down in a grant application, but they basically map to the things that we're already planning on doing or that are on our roadmap already. Uh, and so I think that I can imagine there's a lot of services that other builders who might be less mature, less experienced would want that we don't really need, just because we have a very clear idea of what we want to do and feel a pretty deep sense of accountability that if we do the wrong thing, then we have to stop and course correct. And that's much more important than saying, oh, sure, we did everything that we said we would in our grant application. Fortunately, that there hasn't been any major 180s that we've had to do. But I think that sometimes a grant application can be very prescriptive, and so you have to do exactly these things. And midway through, you realize actually that's not the way. So yeah, fortunately, we never had that situation.
Yeah. And Christoph, do you want to say something?
Yeah, like I'm saying this. I like to say that the grants are always best fit to those builders that plan on doing what they proposed in the grant anyway. And I'm always saying, if you are like if you are fully dependent on getting the grant, whether you will build it or not, then probably better not get a grant. Probably it's not
Right.
not the best way forward. I'm wondering, like how, like what could be improved from your perspective in terms of your relationship with optimism or any other ecosystem. Like how could collectives, how could DAOs improve in their processes, in what they're doing, how they interact with you, uh, so that you could do a better job, and your work could be easier, basically.
So I think there's probably two things. These are a little bit unique to us. The first one is that we kind of believe foundationally that there should be some data sets which are public and viewed as a public good, and that people are all taking, doing work to maintain and to upgrade over time. We don't think DAO should be spending lots of money having every single team index the same data and then build their own models on top of that, because yeah, you're spending money on all the wrong things. You should be really trying to go as quickly as possible to the insights and getting answers to your questions as opposed to building complex, expensive indexing infrastructure. So number one, I think that we would like more teams to be trying to take advantage of some of the public good data sets that we've created and building on top of those. I think the second thing is that we don't want to be seen as like the consultants or the ones that come in with the answers. We really want to be able to make it so that anybody can come and use the data and come up with their own insights and do their own analysis. And so when it comes to how we engage with, say, the Citizens House, we want to get as many good ideas as possible for coming up with metrics and coming up with better ways of measuring the success of retrofunding. Our ideal state would be that we actually do very little of the measurement ourselves, but we're able to direct people towards the ways that they can measure these things and come up with their own metrics, test them, their own ways of evaluating success of the program. We will obviously do that ourselves as much as we need to, because we recognize that there's like a lot of complexity, and it takes good examples and tutorials and case studies before more people can do that. But success would be that there's this like network of data scientists that are doing that kind of work, and we are helping guide them, but we are not viewed as like the only data scientists that care about this problem.
Yeah, I would say in terms of like how we work with the collective, I think there does need to be like a cultural understanding that data can help them, right? I think like governance is a really complicated, multifaceted thing. There's many different components of it. Part of it is strictly like if I had to think about at least a handful of different components that I can think of, part of it really is just political, right? And part of it is, some notion of understanding how power is distributed, how power is decentralized, things like that. And I think it's an important function, but it can't be the only function, right? I think there's also separately, there should be some notion of expertise, right? Like in the federal government, we have agencies where we have the center of like, disease control or, the NIH or NSF or other things. There is room for expertise to help provide strong both opinions, but informed opinions to help governance make better decisions. And I think that's an important part, that there has to be like some desire to want to leverage expertise to make better decisions. And I would say that is something that, it looks very different depending on which ecosystem that you're working on, but there has to be a desire to have a shared goal and want to leverage, insights and understanding to best strategically advance that goal. And once that's in place, then, it's much easier to work with an ecosystem. And particularly because the way that we're structured is open as a public good, we think that this way of doing work with governance is strictly going to be better in the long term. Like I can't imagine something like, the defense industrial complex where you have, a handful of really gigantic mega corporations with proprietary, capture that like completely subsumes how DAO governance ends up making strategic decisions. Like, I don't think anybody would look at that and think, oh, that's what we actually want, is like, a handful of companies that have a bunch of proprietary data sets that tell everybody what to do. I think we have this vision, this broader vision of what, quote unquote, network intelligence, right? So if everything is open, if everything is out there, if everything is forkable, the ability to make smarter decisions, this hive mind of decentralized governance, anybody should be able to, host a Jupyter notebook or take one of Carl's notebooks and fork it and have a better interpretation or a more nuanced way to look at, some particular sector, and post it on Twitter and immediately get that feedback and work without having to think about, whether or not you are working with some high-priced consultant or something like that. I think there's something really powerful about that. And if we can get that just right, I mean, I think we're in this space because we believe that open economies and open ecosystems out-innovate closed and proprietary ones, right? It has to be the case that it's not just a moral right or a, philosophical or idealistic goal. It's actually practical in the sense that when we build things this way, they produce better insights than if we had, the capture of an industrial complex. And so I'm excited about that, but I do think that there does need to be like a cultural understanding that like, that governance is not just a power game and you're not just jockeying for more delegate power to be able to assert your own influence. It's actually, we are trying to achieve a strategic goal together and data helps us get there. And if we believe that to be true, I think we all end up doing pretty well. And OSO hopefully will play, an important role in that.
Yeah, you mentioned governance there. Sorry, Christoph. But do you think the same approach in terms of data applies, or the effects that data can have also applies to like builders in the space in general, like, building an app or DAX or whatever? Do you think like data is something that could help the builders on Optimism, but also in other ecosystems in general? Like,
100%. Yeah, like if you look at how effective startups are today, just looking at tech companies in general, like our understanding and maturity of how to build good businesses has evolved so much. Like this is the analogy that I typically give is like, you remember in the 90s, people just had like little page counters on the bottom right hand corner of their page, and you just like looked at how many times people looked at a page as if that was what value was. And that was like such a primitive notion of impact, but that's what people looked at. And then when they went to go, fundraise with investors, they thought that's what was important. And fast forward a couple decades later, like where we are now and where those primitive analytic systems were back then, night and day, right? Like we have really mature analytics products. We understand retention. We understand lifetime value of the customer. We understand cost of CAC and acquisition costs. Like we understand how to grow businesses methodically through science and repeated experiments because it's a much more rigorous, process now. And I think, at least in my personal limited experience in the decentralized world is that I don't know that everybody has that same level of rigor. One of the things that we actually talked about with the Optimism Collective was like, again, this entire value chain is public. That's insane to me. Like, how crazy would it be if we just airdropped, just produced like dashboards, like rigorous product analytics dashboards for everybody because for every app that's out there because the data is there. Like it's totally possible to measure things like retention for any particular user automatically for any app that's out there. I would love to do these types of things with the community. And that's one of the things that's like actually kind of incredible in this space is that we can do that. Like anybody can come in and in a hackathon project, produce something that has global value to push our abilities forward. So I think one of the things that we are really excited about is leveraging this data to, provide value to builders and help them do their jobs better, help them get more insights into, every aspect of what makes a business, successful, including, potential avenues for lead generation or potential avenues for understanding their users and their customers or potential avenues for understanding usage of their existing strategic decisions so that they can make better strategic decisions in the future. All of that I think is possible. And we definitely want to work with builders to push this industry forward to a level of maturity that I just don't think that we're at yet.
Yeah, Christoph, you wanted to say something earlier.
Yeah. So one thing though that I thinking about, like, how can we get really better data here? Because there are things that one thing that I'm afraid of is that we are measuring only very limited scope of things that really have an impact. And I remember, a few years back, there was this so-called Stack Overflow effect that if Stack Overflow was down, then many product teams had really huge issues in delivering their roadmap on time. Really, like we could see, like I was responsible for delivering software at the time, and it was seen that if Stack Overflow was down, like teams had worse outcomes. I think that the same would be visible today if ChatGPT or Cursor were down. Like I'm absolutely sure that in such cases we would see lower efficiency from the developers. But these are things that we don't measure, we can't measure, we don't know how to measure. Yet they are very impactful. Like for me, like I was always super, impressed with how powerful basic Unix tools are. Like, there is this very limited set of tools that allow you to do almost everything. And like any advancement in software like ties back to this, the cat grep and sad and tools like this. How do we measure that? How do we even approach measuring that impact?
Measuring the impact of a criticality of a particular tool, or measuring like how robust your developer tooling ecosystem is?
No, the impact of a given project, like, because that's something that we are trying to measure in Optimism. Like we, as batch holders, we try to say at the end, we've got like a list of 30 projects, and we need to say that, okay, this project was 10 times more impactful than this one. How do we use data to make those decisions better?
Yeah, I would say in general, this is something that okay, I'm going to give an answer. I don't know if this is going to be like totally satisfying to you because I'm trying to be simultaneously opinionated and unopinionated about these types of things at the same time. So let me try my best. I think on the opinionated side of things, I think there are a lot of different ways to think about criticality of a particular dependency. And let's just take one, for example. Let's just take a look at something like replacement costs, right? Like that's a really common way to think about it. Like if I have a library, can I just hot swap it for another library? If this maintainer goes away, if they like move on to something else, do I have other things that I can use that are actively maintained for security vulnerabilities and this and that? Like is lower replacement cost strictly a good thing, right? Because one of the way that you describe the Stack Overflow effect is that there's a really high replacement cost. Like there really aren't that many alternatives. It is like the one thing. So if it goes down, it obviously has high impact, but is it actually a good thing that replacement costs are, so high? It's actually from like, if my goal was robustness and I wanted to understand how resilient my network is, based on all sorts of different types of external stimuli that might come in and affect the system, like an outage or whatever, or a war. I don't know. Like, I think ultimately low replacement costs are generally considered a good thing. I think that's one of the things that's exciting about like open source software and the forkability is that we are progressively reducing replacement costs and making it easier to switch and making it easier for people to innovate. So I think it's just like I'm kind of in an opinionated fashion, kind of deep diving into this particular example, which is to say there's a couple different ways to look at it. And I'm going to take the unsatisfying part now as like the unopinionated side of things, which is like, this is exactly what governance is there to decide, right? Like, I don't know that governance needs to tell us, okay, I need to fund this specific project because it's like the most important thing. I think actually it's much more important for governance to tell me things like, okay, if I had to stack rank my value systems, am I going to stack rank efficiency and like in terms of like efficiency of capital allocation? So I just want to fund the most important thing as quickly as possible and not spend a more dollar after that. Or is resilience and redundancy actually a desirable trait? And that's something that I want to prioritize over efficiency. Yes, I want efficiency, but not at the cost of redundancy and resilience of my network. These are the things that governance should decide. Every governance is going to decide something different. And I think that's totally okay.
Yeah, and I would just say that the thing that we're really looking to explore with optimism in 2025 is how you can get that kind of quality dimension alongside the metric. So it's one thing to be able to count all of the things, like how many times have you pinged this website or you kind of use this tool, et cetera. But I think actually being able to identify, okay, here are two things that you've used in equal proportions, but which one is actually more important to you? That is where human feedback can be incredibly valuable.
And all right, to start kind of like wrapping up the discussion a little bit, I think I'd be curious to know, I'm not sure if Christoph would as well, what have you been like in the past year? We've seen crazy developments happen, like optimism, retrofunding changed, from RPGF to just retrofunding, and many things happening across the ecosystem. What would be your like if you had to take one takeaway from a data-driven change that you've seen, like something that you've seen in action, like data actually changing things for the better? What would that be if you have like one example out of your head? I know it's a difficult question, so.
I mean, I think that we are at the point right now where it's actually pretty straightforward to use data to filter out the long side of the tail, like the projects that are probably, a bit too early, or maybe they're trying to farm or to kind of, just kind of get in and they don't really have the right kind of impact. So I think, if anything, being able to arrive at a more curated set of projects before it goes to reviewers or badge holders is quite important. It's a bit hard to quantify that. My guess is that maybe 10 or 20% of a funding pool might have gone towards those types of projects in the past. And certainly it saves people a huge amount of time not having to review or to, look at those types of projects. Obviously, there's much more that we want to be able to do. I think that being able to identify the bad projects and the obvious winners is table stakes. The real work is going to be identifying in that middle, okay, which ones are having much more growth or which ones are having really outsized impact. And that's going to require going much deeper into the data.
I would say I probably have two answers, and they all boil down to like, can we make funding allocation better? And I think I have a depth answer and I have a breadth answer. I think on the depth answer, one of the things that's really exciting is that like more and more ecosystems, not just Optimism, but Optimism definitely does do this, is making their goals explicit and then understanding how to leverage data to repeat on the experiment in a depth first fashion, improve and understand how to better allocate towards a particular goal, towards a particular impact. I don't know that we have the right answer yet. I think this is a holy grail and we're still figuring it out. But one of the minor changes, I know that there's like, some branding changes, but like at the end of the day, everything is changing, right? Like between rounds 3, 4, 5, 6, and now 7, we're starting to see a lot more iteration in different ways to design this program. And I think we're getting a better understanding of how to do it. But I think part of one of the reasons why we are trying to get to shorter and shorter, smaller and smaller rounds is that, like, if you think about funding as an intervention, if funding is the stimuli into your network, like, you need to be able to regularly do that experiment where you do some amount of, like, you insert the stimuli, you do the intervention, and then you measure the outcome of how this network responds to it, because it's a very complicated stochastic network. You have like developers and they have companies and they're shipping things and there's users and all these other things. It's not a deterministic system. It's not a computer program where I can just like know on the other end of it what's going to happen. So I have to be doing these types of experiments where I am inserting this funding stimuli regularly and measuring the outcome. So that's the depth answer. That's really exciting. I think it's going to be impossible for humans to do due diligence on every single possible project on a time scale of, I don't know, weeks or days, but we can do that with data. We can do that with automation. Like, we can make funding allocation decisions in a much more scalable fashion and much more reduced time frame, finer grained fashion, so that we can run these types of experiments regularly. And now we live in a world, the techniques that we use here are going to be totally different than the techniques that we use in the broader tech community. But think about the analogy that I would described earlier, where back in the day, people used to just build a landing page or build a website and they had a little page counter. Now we live in a world where, like, a company like Amazon probably does on the order of 5 to 6 figures worth of different A/B tests, like, every year. Probably more is what I'm guessing, but like very, very frequently to better optimize and better understand the system. That's the level of depth that we're like just in the early days of figuring out how to get there, but we're starting, and there's an understanding that that's important. That's cool. So that's my depth answer. On the breadth answer, I think there's something that's like really powerful about, the ability to experiment with different types of funding mechanisms. Like, I don't think OSO is, inherent, like, it's a data lake, right? So you can use it for any kind of funding mechanism that you want. I think we are excited about retrofunding in that experiment, but there are other things that are happening right now that, wouldn't be possible without more data and big data in a data lake. One of the things that we only recently started working on, but seems to have, like, gotten a lot of traction and got a lot of interest, is this deep funding thing that, we're doing with a bunch of people from Gitcoin and Vitalik and VoiceDeck. But this idea that we can actually take data and train machine learning models on what are the ways to better allocate towards particular projects. That's a whole new thing that spun up in less than a month, which is incredible to see, partly because all that data is already there, and we cleaned it up and we made it easy for people to do these types of experiments. So I think there's going to be, as these types of little building blocks come up, not just the data, but also the coordination element, and different algorithms and different open source libraries, and different experiences that we can learn from each other. I think as we build up this toolkit, we're going to start to see way more experimentation, which I think is also going to be super cool, because we don't know what causes growth today. Like, we have no idea whether any of these systems work. I think, like, we are just copying a bunch of techniques that we have used for close to a decade now. And, I think there is a lot more rigor that we can apply to designing better airdrop programs, designing better grant programs, designing better retrofunding, what have you. I think, we're just in the very early days of figuring this out. So it's super exciting.
Love how you went above and beyond to answer the question. But also, I think, like, the bold and spicy take, which I fully resonate with, is that it's like oftentimes we masquerade as knowing what drives growth, but as it is proven time and time again, at least in crypto with those airdrops and funding mechanism, whatever. Like sometimes maybe not so much. Like it's just things that kind of like fall in the right place, but simply because it rhymes doesn't mean that's kind of like what caused it. So yeah, 100% agree. All right, I don't have any more questions for you guys. I'm not sure if Christoph wants to throw up one final question or not.
No, I just wanted to say that I'm like looking forward to, come back to the discussion, let's say maybe a half a year or a year from now and see like what changed, what have we learned and like where are we going forward? Like it will be super interesting.
Likewise, we should start a podcast and bring LTV on because honestly, Carl and I regularly talk about you guys as like charting a really interesting path and as an example to learn from. And we follow what you guys do. We've been, learning from what we can of what we see on the outside, but would love to learn more and share insights.
Yeah, I'll say, to end on a funny note, in crypto, if you just survive a year, you've done great. It's such a fast-moving industry.
Especially through a bear market, being
Yeah, last
without a
years.
token, being bootstrapped. So hopefully there's just more good things to come.
Yeah, let's hope so. All right, well, Carl, Raymond, it was a pleasure having you on KYB. Thank you so much for taking the time. And yes, thanks everyone for listening in. Christoph, any closing remarks? Nope.
See you soon.
All right.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank
See
you.
guys.